Okay, I'm Dan O'Malley, former two-sport professional athlete in boxing and wrestling, and I'm with Hannibal at Hannibal TV, and Hannibal is at the International Sports Hall of Fame induction ceremonies, of which I am a member of the Global Advisory Board, and we welcome you to watch the interview with me, Dan O'Malley, as well as all things Hannibal and all things International Sports Hall of Fame at the Arnold Sports Festival. Be there.
This is Hannibal from the HannibalTV.com, and this is going to be an extended interview here with Dan O'Malley, who is a former professional wrestler, boxer, and he's also on the Global Advisory Board for the Arnold Sports Hall of Fame. And before we forget, would you like to start this off, Mr. O'Malley, by showing us the medal you have here?
Oh yes, this is something that the International Sports Hall of Fame presents to all of their athletes that get inducted, and I'm going to reach over here and pick it up so we can show the people around the globe the gold medal that people like Rocky Blyer, Bruno Sammartino, Archie Griffin, Kurt Angle, many of the great athletes that we've honored, Ronda Rousey, have received this from Dr. Bob Goldman and Governor Schwarzenegger. And it's a high honor for me to be on the advisory board, but it's also even a higher honor for these athletes to be awarded this prestigious medal. And I think that someday maybe Hannibal will have one around his neck. We hope so for kickboxing, wrestling. One of the things, we know you're going to get one of these someday.
And you might actually help show me a few boxing techniques. You already showed me a couple today that I'm going to practice in sparring, but let's start off a bit about your athletic career. Do you want to tell us about, I know your first pro sport was boxing, but before that, how did you start off?
Well, I appreciate that. In high school, Hannibal, I tried football, basketball, and eventually wrestling. And that's what got me started in athletics. And then while I was in college playing basketball, or trying to play basketball, the coach suggested we all go box. And so we went down to the Golden Gloves gym, and I liked boxing, and so I ended up getting involved in that sport. And somehow I had evolved into professional fighting, and was fortunate enough to be called upon by Buster Douglas's father one day to come over and fight Buster in his first pro fight, because his opponent didn't show up. So that's how I ended up fighting Buster Douglas, because the original guy he was supposed to fight failed to appear. And so that's how I got that. And it was a war. I wasn't in shape and he was, and we stood there and pounded on each other for about 3 rounds or so, and until finally he just wore me out and knocked me down, and the referee stopped the fight. And that's what happened with me and Buster.
What do you think about Buster Douglas's career? It's unusual. He had that probably the biggest upset in boxing history against Mike Tyson. Then after he lost to Holyfield, he ended up ballooning up to 400 pounds. Then he made a comeback, ended up having a pretty successful comeback. But what are your thoughts on his career in general?
Well, you know, James Douglas was probably one of the best all-around athletes that I had ever seen, Hannibal. And he was a great basketball player in high school. He was a great football player. Played on state championship basketball team. Went to college for basketball. And he was also a National Police Athletic League gloves champion. And so he was no bum starting out. But he was also his own worst enemy when it came to training. I mean, I don't think he liked to train as hard as it was needed sometimes. But obviously, when he trained when he was motivated the most by his mother's passing, and he got in such great condition and went over there and showed his skills as he could have shown all the time against Mike Tyson. Of course, we know that he knocked Tyson out, and then he came back here. They had a big parade for him, and then his next fight was with Evander Holyfield. And I used to joke with people. I said I lasted longer with Buster than Buster lasted with Evander Holyfield. So, and then I think he just went through some personal, as we all do in our lives, some personal problems. He ate, got himself up. I never really got him on the scale to see how much he weighed, so I wouldn't question that. But I know he had had some diabetic issues, but he did make a pretty good comeback. But once again, he was up and down, he had got beat by a couple guys that I think that if he'd have been in real good shape, he would have beaten them hands down. So, and today, in fact, I was with Buster on Thanksgiving, right the night before Thanksgiving. We had a big party for him, and he's in great shape. He's coaching boxing here in Columbus. He's got all his mental faculties, financially well-to-do. So, I think, he's something to be proud of.
And you had a decent pro boxing career. You've already given me some boxing advice, but what's your general boxing advice for boxers out there?
In all seriousness, I always believed, don't get hit. As you can see, and we know now with CTE and all the problems people have with their brains after football, wrestling, and boxing, the best thing you can do is not get hit. And I always thought the best offense is a good defense when it comes to boxing. And that's what has helped me out. I mean, I had somewhere around a dozen pro fights and about 40-some amateur fights. And I didn't care, how tough you needed to be or how tough you were. You didn't have to prove any of that. I think it's, you hit your opponent and don't let him hit you.
Now, not a lot of boxers actually go into professional wrestling. There's very few I can think of, and you're one of them. How did you make that transition?
Well, it's funny we should speak because you're a wrestler who's going into boxing, and I was a boxer who went into wrestling. And I'll tell you what, from high school, from probably the time I was born, my mother must have been watching wrestling there in the hospital, because from day one I can remember as a little child watching like Buddy Rogers and Billy Darnell and guys like that wrestling on television, and my mother would come over and turn it off because she didn't want me watching it. Of course, then the more your parents don't want you to do something, that makes you want to do it, right? So, I loved wrestling. I started following it and when I was in high school, and became a big fan of the sport. Went to wrestling matches, watching the Sheik throw fire at people, out of the Detroit territory, and watching Bobo Brazil hit the people with the cocoa butt, and watching Bruno. It was just amazing. It was so entertaining. So when I got out of college, there was what you call outlaw wrestling, like
Independent leagues,
independent,
fighting the established promotion, I guess.
Yes, that would have been it. And where guys would be Bummy Rogers instead of Buddy Rogers, or Hobo Brazil versus Bobo Brazil, And so there was an independent wrestling group that I knew of, and I asked the guy, I said, "Man, I love wrestling. I want to be a wrestler." And they kept me out of it. The guy said, "Oh man, you're too young," and another time, "You're too skinny." And this is funny. I had even, as I was getting in better condition, I called down to Atlanta. Al Snow has the same story, except he went down. I called up and talked to Ole Anderson.
Right.
And I was offered personally by Ole Anderson a tryout for World Georgia Championship Wrestling. And one of the guys here in Columbus, he was a commissioner, a local boxing commissioner. I was all excited, and I went and said, "Hey, I'm going down to Georgia, and Ole Anderson's going to give me a tryout to become a pro wrestler." And this gentleman he was in the know. Like I say, he was one of the boxing wrestling commissioners, and he knew a lot more than I did. And he said, "Son, don't go down there." He said, "They're going to hurt you. Trust me, just believe me, and don't go." So I didn't. And so then I kind of filed that back in my mind because, as just an episode, until I met Al Snow, and we were sitting talking one day, and he told me that he went to the tryout. He went down, and I think, they told him to come to, was it like Greensboro or
Yeah, he actually
Charlotte?
told the story in our first shoot interview with him. If you search that up on
Oh,
Hannibal
yes.
TV,
Yeah.
they bid him, actually. I think Ole or Gene bid him during that tryout when he started to do well in the amateur wrestling match, but before it was basically just a beating.
Yes, well, and so I didn't go do that, but I would have had that same treatment had I not gone there. So I just, so I was a fan, and I had been, involved with boxing, and I saw that really wasn't going to, pan out for me to be like a Jerry Cooney or somebody like that. So I just started hitting the gym, just becoming a fitness person, lifting weights, doing athletic activities. And there was a wrestler who was semi-retired that worked out in the gym with me. His father was the legendary brass knuckles champion Bull Curry, and this was Flying Fred Curry, who was a legend in his own right, the master of the flying drop kick, and a great all-around, tremendous all-around wrestler. So for about a year, we'd train together, lift weights, and I would tell Fred, "Hey man, I love that stuff. I watch it and this and that." And finally one day he said, "If you really want to be a professional wrestler, I'll teach you. I will train you how to be a professional wrestler." So with that, about 3 or 4 times a week, we would go to another gym, where they had a ring, and Fred had a couple professional wrestlers that he was, training, and guys that hung around with him. A guy by the name of Bobby Pico, and another guy by the name of Wild Bull Miller, who just recently passed away, and they just beat me to death. I mean, I was basically, what would you call it, a bump taker or a dummy, a bump taking
tackling dummy, I like to call it. I did that when I was training as well.
Yeah, I was a bump taking dummy, learning how to take suplexes and this and that, and then finally learning how to give the holds. And then we had some matches there in the gym itself, and so that's how I got involved with it. And
do you think they treated you with a little more respect, knowing that you were a pro boxer in the past, so they may have been a little easier on you, knowing you could handle yourself?
Well, these guys all knew me. Most of the people knew me from the local reputation that I had established around here, both in the ring and outside of the ring. Maybe I was a little bit naughty.
Yeah, I think I read that you were actually, your first round of university, you partied too much, and you ended up kind of leaving university.
Yes.
And you ended up doing well for yourself after that. But,
yes. Well, I left the university because we just had too much fun, and sometimes we didn't take any static from anyone in some of those campus bars, and so we developed a name for ourselves, which we're not proud of now. But so that's what happened there, and so these guys knew that, and also they knew that I could wrestle, because when we started out, you're supposed to be light. And I would grab these guys and take them down, and they'd say, whoa, wait a minute, lighten up. So they knew that I could wrestle. And I never had anyone really try to take advantage of me, as some guys do. I mean, we know that some guys get in there that really can't fight, but they're great pro-style wrestlers, and they're light as a feather, they're smooth. But when it comes,
I think CM Punk is the best example of that.
Well, a tremendous athlete until he had to start fighting, right? I mean, isn't his record 0-2?
Yeah, but he did make, I believe, $500,000 a fight, so I guess he was still a winner in some ways.
So he's made about, if he made $500,000 a fight and he's 0-2, so he got $1 million. So that's probably about $980,000 more than I ever made in my career. So
I guess he was more successful in some ways, if you want to talk about the bread and butter of it.
The bread and butter, the cash on the table, but I'll tell you what, from the fun, I mean, I've had the chances to my childhood dream was the night I wrestled Bobo Brazil. I mean, it was weird, because I never really thought of any of this until, I'm in the ring, the lights are on, and it's just me and him. I could hear this kind of a roar. There's lots of people in this building, so I could hear the people, but all I could see was this big figure across the ring from me, and I thought to myself, this is what I used to see on television when I was a kid. And I'm wrestling one of my childhood heroes, and it almost sent a chill up my spine, so I've realized my childhood dreams in professional wrestling.
You wrestled the Sheik too, who is a very popular subject on this channel.
Sheik came here. Fred Curry promoted the show, and I believe Fred Curry and a group of other businessmen. And it was supposed to be like a tag team match, featuring, of course, Flying Fred Curry, the Sheik, Bobo Brazil, and myself. And as you know, if there's a lot of people on this YouTube channel or this around the world on Hannibal TV that know about the Sheik, especially in his later years, they know that his matches usually never even made it to the ring. They were so wild and crazy that they'd end up maybe close to the ring or not even anywhere near the
He'd
ring.
attack the guy on the way to the ring and from behind, and there'd be a little outside battle and double DQ, or he'd make it in the ring and the other guy would be counted out.
Yeah, and so the time that I was involved with it, I remember that I came out of the locker room and I was with Fred. I can't remember how it was supposed to go, but all I remember is that the Sheik was going to grab me around the neck and going to start poking me with a pencil or some sort of a foreign object. And we didn't even. He came out. He threw a fireball at Fred Curry, and then they told me to do something, and what do they call it? A schmoz when it ends in a big. It was just a schmoz, and so that was the last. And then another time the Sheik came. He came here. I didn't wrestle him, but he had brought Sabu, and they also brought Chris Candido, the late Chris Candido, and
Who his ex-wife, unfortunately, has just been arrested again for 6 DUI. I don't know if you heard about that.
Well, I haven't heard about poor Tammy. She's got to be. She can't get out of her own way. Is that the best way to put it?
I think her and Scott Hall hold the WWE rehab records for most amount of money spent.
Well, poor. What can you say? I mean, Scott Hall. He embarrassed himself as well as the whole Cleveland Wrestling Federation up there. You remember when he came to Cleveland and kind of like passed out in the ring when he was supposed to wrestle, and that's well noted. And I wouldn't say anything against Scott Hall because I know he's tried to fix himself up, but it seems like he almost has a permanent, face on from taking too many. Italian face, we call it.
And I caused you to digress there, but you were mentioning Sabu and Candido were on a show with the Sheik.
Okay, well, yes. Sabu and Chris Candido came in, and it was the Sheik. And I had never seen, this was, Sabu had just started wrestling probably not too long before this. This is back in the early 90s. And he came to town and set this place on fire. I mean, it was like more than the Sheik ever did Reborn. And I thought, wow, this guy's going to be even bigger and better than the Sheik. But for some reason, he didn't make it quite over the top, but he sure made it to become a legend, a hardcore legend in this business.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that things didn't turn out that great for him in the end. And another guy you said that you looked up to growing up was Buddy Rogers, who I understand was kind of a role model for you, and he mentored you a little bit.
Yes, after I'd started wrestling, there was some notice in me because I'm 6'6", 255 pounds at the time, and I could work a little bit. So there was mention of me going into the WWF at the time, and Larry Sharp and Charlie Fulton who were mentoring me. Remember the Monster Factory?
Yes.
Pretty boy Larry Sharp.
I think now it's the official development camp of Ring of Honor, the new Monster Factory.
Right. Danny Cage has done a tremendous job with that business. But at the time, Larry Sharp suggested I go down there and meet with Buddy Rogers, and Buddy was training certain guys and giving guys psychology tips and moves and things like that. So I went down there and spent off and on a couple months with Buddy Rogers, and he was just a tremendous guy to be around. And he told me about his career and some of the inside things that he did, and he was he didn't like to wrestle guys he didn't like. If he wanted to wrestle you, then you would be wrestling him every night and you'd be getting a good payday.
So he had his group of guys that he brought around with him if a promoter wanted to book him.
Right, and I know that Billy Darnell, Bobo Brazil was one of Buddy Rogers' guys. Buddy liked Bobo.
Did he ever tell you the true story of what happened to him that night? I guess he was attacked in the dressing room or something earlier on in his career.
That happened in Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, really?
Right here.
It
happened right here at the old Memorial Hall. And Buddy Rogers this was at the time when he was like the NWA type champion. And he was also McMahon's had made him wasn't he the first WWF champion? Yeah. So he told me that Al Haft and Sam Muchnick, they came to him and said, actually here in Columbus, Haft on behalf of Muchnick said, look, we don't want you having both belts. And Buddy says, well, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to wrestle for you, and I'm going to wrestle for McMahon. That's what I'm going to do. And so he said that they really didn't say anything other than, well, we really wish you wouldn't do that. But he said he'd wrestled that night, and after he said he went back to the dressing room, and Dr. Big Bill Miller, who's from Columbus, an Ohio State graduate, Dr. Big Bill Miller and Carl Gotch came into the locker room, and Buddy said Miller blocked the door, and Gotch said, okay, now he said, now we're going to wrestle for real. And if nothing was mentioned about him, you know, working for both, you know, or not working for both, but they got into it, and he broke his wrist or his thumb, and trying to get out. Like he said that Gotch was chasing him, and Miller was, you know, and he said that he said his quote, he said, he juked Bill Miller and got him out of position and got the hell out of there. And that was what he told me from his own.
And it wasn't like he wasn't tough, because even just before he died, didn't he knock somebody out in a restaurant?
Yeah, I was down there. I wasn't there. I was down there in Florida like the week before he did that. Some guy had either took a lady, insulted someone, or I mean, it's a known story. So, but yeah, he did take care of himself, and he you know beat up some perpetrator. But Buddy, I was down there, and he kept, you know, telling me, you know, he said, you're built like Killer Kowalski. And he said, you have to become like Killer Kowalski. This is the type heel that he thought I should have been. So,
did he ever tell you his true opinion of Ric Flair, who would have been using the Nature Boy moniker by then as well?
Well, whether it's true or false, I mean, he had no reason to babyface me. But he said that he thought Ric Flair was a good. I mean, I got the babyface version of it. He said that Ric Flair came to him, asked him if he could have that gimmick, and that Buddy agreed to let him have that gimmick. But so he was all, you know, very praising Ric Flair. But then again, he turned around and made the comment that we've all heard from everyone, the negative thing where Ric Flair wrestles the same match every night, which kind of did, but I couldn't wrestle.
It worked for him.
Well, yeah, it worked for him. So that's the only negative. If you want to construe that as negative, that's the only thing negative I ever heard Buddy say about Ric Flair.
Now, on the opposite end of Buddy, there was their real life and in-ring enemies, Bruno Sammartino and Buddy Rogers. But you were friends with Bruno as well. I have any stories about him?
Well, it's like remember Breakfast with Blassie we talked about. Well, I had breakfast with Bruno several times, and when he was here, we inducted him into the Sports Hall of Fame. And one of the things Bruno and I had talked about, because I was actually a stooge, I guess you could call it, for Buddy Rogers, because I liked him, and if he was young and wrestling when I would have tried to have been one of his buddies, you know. But Bruno was on the opposite side of the fence, where he said that Buddy was difficult, you know, with promoters, would check out the house and then hold the guy up, which I didn't know whether, you know, I told Bruno I wasn't in the room, so I don't know that. And he said that Buddy would only want to work with guys that he, you know, wanted to work with, and I'm thinking, well, okay. But there was just some, I think, and Buddy Rogers at one time disrespected Bruno, okay? That's one thing. And then I guess when Bruno was on his way up, like the first time,
yeah,
Buddy Rogers had something to do, according to Bruno, and
he was blackballed for a while.
According to some other sources as well, Buddy Rogers was one of the factors behind Bruno getting barred or kicked out of the WWF, and Bruno had to go down and wrestle in Florida and wrestle all over the place.
In Toronto, and I think he got really over in Toronto.
Oh yeah, that's where he got big in Toronto and up in Canada, and then he eked back down into the United States, like going into Buffalo and places, until he became so huge that they had to take him back. And but that's why I don't think he ever forgave Rogers for that.
And Nick Bockwinkel's one of the all-time greats in any historian's category. I know you were friends with him. Do you have anything to share about him?
Well, you know, Nick Bockwinkel, to me, if you had to say who's the all-time greatest wrestler, I think you would have to agree, or many people would.
That it's Hannibal.
Yes, Hannibal is probably one. I know one thing about Hannibal because I've seen you wrestle. You're probably one of the toughest wrestlers that ever came out of Canada, and that includes guys like Dino Bravo and Rick Martel and all of those guys, because not only you were a natural a wrestler, but you're a real wrestler in the amateur ranks, and I don't think anyone could really have beaten you. So, Canada's greatest athlete sitting right beside me. Not Iron Mike Sharp, but Hannibal himself is Canada's greatest athlete.
No, and I think Iron Mike Sharp actually got his butt kicked in the dressing room in WWE one day, so he wasn't really that tough. But back to Bockwinkel.
Bockwinkel. Well, Nick Bockwinkel and I had worked together quite a bit after he'd gotten out of wrestling. And, of course, he was always coming. He would come and work at our trade shows with us for the paper companies that I represented. But he would tell me all about his wrestling career, how he went over to Hawaii. But actually, how Bockwinkel got started, his father, Warren Bockwinkel, was a pro wrestler back in the 30s and 40s, and they were very good friends with the Thez family, who obviously Lou Thez, who was the greatest champion, one of the greatest. And Warren and Lou Thez were good friends, and both out of St. Louis. And when Nick Bockwinkel was 14, 15, 16 years old, he was training with Lou Thez. So, wow. How much better does it get than getting trained by Lou Thez? And so he started there, and then his dad moved out to California and had a cement truck route. I didn't know if you knew that. But so Nick drove the cement trucks and worked when he was in high school, and that built him up real good. And he wrestled around the Pacific Northwest, and he said he was a baby face in California for a good while, and he really never took off till he went to Minneapolis and got with Vern Gagne. And somehow, he clicked with Vern and Ray Stevens, Ray the Crippler Stevens, who, by the way, is from Columbus, Ohio here.
And he's one of the greatest ever, too. He just maybe partied a little too much to be trusted with the NWA World title.
Well, so Ray the Crippler Stevens and Nick became just inseparable, and their families were inseparable, and they just had a great time. And Bockwinkel didn't drink. He didn't smoke or drink. Yeah. He stayed home reading a dictionary. That's exactly what he did. You've heard Bockwinkel's talking. He was probably one of the greatest talkers in history, and one of the smartest people in wrestling. So.
And the last wrestler I'll ask you about today is the Honky Tonk Man, who you told me that you traveled with a bit, and it's been announced finally, they're inducting him into the WWE Hall of Fame this year.
Well, Honky Tonk Man was always one of my favorites. I followed him back when he was Wayne Ferris, and when it was Latham and Ferris, the
Blonde Bombers,
the notorious tag team down there in Memphis. And I didn't realize he was Jerry Lawler's cousin. So that might have had something to do with it. But I found out that he's also a very intelligent guy, that he was a school teacher during wrestling careers and all that. So and he's going to be here, he's going to be in Ohio for Bobby Fulton on the 16th of March. He's going to be wrestling, and then I don't know when they're having the WWE.
I believe it's April.
April?
Yeah.
Okay, so
April 6th, I think, actually.
Well,
the Hannibal TV is going to be covering WrestleMania weekend, by the way, for all the fans watching.
Hannibal's going to be doing a lot of things at WrestleMania. In fact, one of Hannibal's very dear friends, I'll tell you a little bit about the Honky Tonk Man. One of your very dear friends, superstar Billy Graham, had mentioned that one of his favorite wrestlers was Wayne Ferris, a.k.a. the Honky Tonk Man, because the Honky Tonk Man took care of his body. He never took any crazy bumps. He never smoked. He never drank that we know of.
I don't know about not drinking, but yeah.
And he was smart, as they say in the wrestling business. He took care of his money, which a lot of guys didn't. I never knew what that meant.
Oh, he definitely did.
So he doesn't like to leave tips for waitresses. I do know that, which I don't agree with that Honky Tonk Man, but. You got to do what you got to do to put food on the table for your family. But yeah, I traveled with him one time. It was when he and Greg the Hammer Valentine were tag team partners, and I was putting my toe in the water to see if I wanted to be in the WWF as a wrestler. And it does. I mean, we could talk about that another time. How it destroys your family, destroys your career,
Yeah, I think we'll have
destroys
to
your
have a
life.
part 2 maybe next year.
Yeah, next year we can do a part 2. But the Honky Tonk Man, I went with him. We flew to Worcester, Massachusetts, and got in a car, and the whole time he was teasing Greg the Hammer Valentine, because Greg the Hammer Valentine had mysteriously lost his real Rolex watch the night before, and the story goes that some quote friend of Greg's reached in his pocket late during the night and took the watch from him and left. And so that's a story for a pay-per-view interview.
And a couple more people I'll ask you about before we close this off,
Sure.
because they're setting up for the International Sports Hall of Fame that's going on tomorrow here, that we're excited to cover for the first time. But Arnold Schwarzenegger, you've been actually working with him over the past numerous years in relation to this Hall of Fame. What's that like?
I'll tell you what, working with and around Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger has always been a pleasure, because he's a consummate professional. He always takes the time to, talk to the little people, see how you're doing, how you feeling, what's going on. And I think that, and that's a great humanitarian effort in itself, because he doesn't have to do that. He's a very big man in stature and in life. So it's been a joy, and really working with Dr. Bob Goldman, the chairman of this whole thing, the founder of the International Sports Hall of Fame, has been just a marvelous experience for me. I feel like back in the old days, there was a baseball player that got picked to do some commercials, and his name was Marvelous Marv Throneberry. Did you ever hear him?
I have not.
Okay, well,
I'll look him up.
he was the first guy to do the light beer commercials, and he would say, "I don't know why they picked me to do this commercial," and that was his catchphrase. And I feel like I don't know why they picked me to be involved with the Sports Hall of Fame and where I've gotten, but I'm honored and pleased to be a part of it.
And the website is sportshalloffame.org. Do you want to let us know where people can follow you? I know you have your own website as well as a Facebook page.
I think they could come on Facebook, or it's www.therealdanomaley.com, and the Sports Hall of Fame is www.sportshof.org. And but the most important thing that anyone could ever think about, anyone could ever dream about, anyone could ever do, is to get on your computer or on your television and get onto Hannibal TV, because let me tell you something, not just today, but for tomorrow and the future, that's where it's at.
Definitely, every year we grow, and of course our official website is HannibalTV.com. But thanks for inviting us up here. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for talking to us.
And I'd like to meet you one time in the squared circle, just one time.
Maybe it'll have to be a boxing sparring session.
Okay, you got it.